Hello, Glenn Sample here. Today I'd like to tell you a story about a failed business deal between Bobby Baker and a man named Ralph Hill. Now, if you're not familiar with Bobby Baker, well, he started off as a $20,000 a year employee of Lyndon Johnson, and he became the secretary of the Senate Democratic Committee. He handled all the money, and within a few years, he became a multimillionaire. Now, this sounds familiar to another man that you're probably familiar with, and that would be Billy Saul Estes. Estes, too, was a compatriot, you might say, of Lyndon Johnson. He was also involved in crooked, dishonest business deals with Lyndon Johnson. And both of these men, Bobby Baker and Billy Saul Estes, spent time in prison for Lyndon Johnson. Now, you may not be familiar with the name Ralph Hill, but stick with me and we'll see how this failed business deal between Bobby Baker and Ralph Hill gave motive for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I'd like to ask you a question now. Do you recall seeing this November 8th Life magazine cover? And the title was The Bobby Baker Bombshell. Well, the date of this magazine, November 8th, 1963, just a few days before the assassination of Kennedy, and its provocative cover title really reveal the growing stories of corruption and political misconduct that were putting Vice President Lyndon Johnson in a very uncomfortable spotlight. So Phil Brennan, who is a veteran journalist, back in November of 2003, wrote an article about this failed business deal between Bobby Baker and Ralph Hill that we've already talked about. And I think it's so important to understand what went on in the latter half of 1963 and how this little event can educate us and help us to understand the motivation behind JFK's assassination. Now listen to Phil's article as I read it. He begins like this. Sometime in early 1963, I was approached by a young lady with whom I had worked on Nixon's 1960 campaign staff. She asked me if I would meet with her fiancé, who was in great difficulty and in danger of being murdered. I agreed to meet with her fiancé, a South Carolinian named Ralph Hill. We met at the Market Inn, had a couple of martinis, and Hill told me his tale of woe. He had come to Washington some time before and was steered to a fellow South Carolinian, one Bobby Baker, the powerful Secretary of the Senate and a very close associate of Lyndon Johnson. To make a long story short, Baker advised Hill to go into the vending machine business and promised him he'd arrange to get some major defense contractors to install the machines, which vended soft drinks, sandwiches, cigarettes, and the like. There was only one catch. Baker wanted under-the-table payoffs for his part in setting up what would be a very lucrative business opportunity with tens of thousands of potential customers who worked in defense plants. True to his word, Baker got a number of defense contractors to agree to allow Hill the exclusive right to install his vending machines on their premises. It was an opportunity to print money by the barrel, and with those golden contracts in hand, Hill was able to go to the bank and borrow all the funds he needed to buy the vending machines and to go into business. And for a while he prospered, as did Bobby Baker. But whatever he was paying Baker was not enough to satisfy the man who for all intents and purposes had the Senate under his thumb. He saw that the members of the Democratic majority got what they wanted: money, bimbos, LBJ's help, you name it. They were all in his pocket. He could arrange multi-million-dollar contracts for the defense industry or take them away if he wanted. He was LBJ's guy and was all-powerful and a very dangerous man to have as an enemy, a fact that Ralph Hill learned when Baker put the bite on him for bigger payoffs. The problem for Hill was that he had big payments to make on the loans he'd taken out to buy the equipment and set himself up in business. He had some pretty steep overhead and simply didn't have enough left over to boost his payments to Baker. He tried to explain the fact of life to Baker, but the Secretary of the United States Senate wasn't having any of it. He simply repeated his demands and threatened Hill that if he didn't pay up, he'd see that Hill lost all those juicy defense plant contracts. Oh, bad went to worse. Baker made good on his threats, and Hill was facing bankruptcy. Moreover, it was made known to him that if he didn't simply fold his tent and go off without making trouble for Baker, he might meet up with an unfortunate and probably fatal accident. But Hill was facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything he had, and he simply would not give up. He was fighting for his life, and he had the guts to hang in there. He asked me to help, but I was completely a creature of the House side of the Capitol Hill. The Senate side was foreign territory, and I hate to admit it, I didn't even have the vaguest idea who this Bobby Baker, the Senate's imperial potentate, was. I told Hill that his only way out was to expose Baker publicly, to get the story out. Once it was public, Baker could not afford to retaliate. I advised Hill to file a suit against Baker, laying out all the sordid details in the complaint. And once he had served Baker, to give me the complaint papers, and I'd see to it that the media on the Hill got their hands on the copies. Well, he did, and I did. And now I found myself a potential target, not only on Baker's part, but of the media world as well. But that's another story. I was able to get only 2 reporters to write the story. The late Clark Mollenhoff, one of the best investigators in Washington, and one other whose name I don't recall. For the most part, the Washington Press Corps kept the lid on the story until the late Bob Humphrey, then the GOP Senate leadership's spokesman, an incredibly gifted strategist and a mentor, asked me to tell the story to the late Delaware Republican Senator John Williams, a crusader for good government and a crackerjack of an investigator himself. Senator Williams asked me to introduce him to Hill, and I did. They got together with some Senate investigators for the GOP minority, and Hill told them the whole story, including the part played by Vice President Johnson. Williams got his committee to launch an investigation, and the lid came off. A few days later, the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy called 5 of Washington's top reporters into his office and told them it was now open season on Lyndon Johnson. It's okay, he told them, to go after the story they were ignoring out of deference to the administration. And from that point on until the events in Dallas, Lyndon Baines Johnson's future looked as if it included a sudden end to his political career and a few years in the penitentiary as well. The Kennedys had their knives out and sharpened for him and were determined to draw his political blood, all of it. In the Senate, the investigation into the Baker case was moving quickly ahead. Even the Democrats were cooperating, thanks to the Kennedys. An awful lot of really bad stuff was being revealed, right up until November 22nd, 1963. By November 23rd, all Democratic cooperation suddenly stopped. Lyndon would serve a term and a half in the White House instead of the slammer. The Baker investigation would peter out, and Bobby Baker would serve a short 16-month sentence and then go free. Dallas accomplished all of that. Sometimes I wonder if I had not met Hill and convinced him to go public with the story, and the Bobby Baker case and Lyndon's part in it had not come out as a result, would Dallas not have happened? I don't like to think about that. And so that's where this Life magazine comes from. LBJ faced some pretty awful prospects, including not only being dumped from the 1964 ticket, but also spending a long, long time in the slammer as a result of his role in the rapidly expanding Bobby Baker case.
It's recording now.
Okay. Take 3.